The United Nations warns of very bleak future as heat waves will make regions uninhabitable within just decades. Within decades, heat waves caused by climate change will become so extreme in some regions of the world that human life there would be unsustainable, the United Nations and Red Cross have warned. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC, released a new report saying that aggressive steps need to be taken immediately to avert potentially recurrent heat disasters. The report comes ahead of the 2022 UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, that will be taking place in Egypt next month. MSN reports in a statement the UN said, in the coming decades, heat waves are predicted to meet and exceed human physiological and social limits in regions such as Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and Southwest Asia. Humanitarian needs are already high in these regions, which would lead to large-scale suffering and death, pollution, population movements, and further entrenched inequality. Previous research has indicated that the number of poor people living in extreme heat conditions in urban areas will increase sevenfold by the middle of the century, with both West Africa and Southeastern Asia especially hard hit. Red Cross Secretary General Jagan Chapagain called for investment in both adaptation and mitigation, with a focus on those countries that are the most vulnerable. He said, "We don't want to dramatize it, but certainly the data shows that it does lead towards a very bleak future." He added that at COP27, we will urge world leaders to ensure that this investment reaches local communities that are on the front line of the climate crisis. If communities are prepared to anticipate climate crisis risks and equipped to take action, we'll prevent extreme weather events from becoming humanitarian disasters. The new report emphasizes how heat waves act to exacerbate existing inequalities, with isolated and marginalized communities tending to suffer the greatest impacts. The UN Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said, as the climate crisis goes unchecked, extreme weather events such as heat waves and floods are hitting the most vulnerable people the hardest. Nowhere is the impact more brutally felt than the countries already reeling from hunger, conflict, and poverty. This, the international organization said, is despite the tragic irony that the world's lowest income nations tend to be the least to blame for human-driven climate change. Furthermore, the UN said vulnerable communities such as agricultural workers are being pushed to the front lines of the climate crisis. They said, meanwhile, elderly people, children, and pregnant and breastfeeding women face higher risks of illness and death. The report outlined 5 key steps that the world could take to support the most vulnerable people in the regions where episodic heat waves become the new normal. First, they said forecasting of such extreme weather conditions should be made available to all, allowing governments, local first responders, and the public to make preparations, while authorities should find new and more sustainable ways to finance such activities. And alongside this, the report argues that humanitarian organizations need to adapt to heat wave conditions. As the UN notes, some groups have already begun exploring such measures as more thermally appropriate energy housing, cooling centers, and so-called green roofs. These involve the planting of vegetation atop of the buildings. Studies have shown that they can help mitigate heat island effect in urban settings. And finally, the UN said, addressing the impact of extreme heat also requires strengthening engagement across humanitarian development and climate spheres. The full findings of the report, which is entitled Extreme Heat, Preparing for the Heat Waves of the Future, were published on the IFRC website. This is by Neem Harris on News Punch. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.